The train's whistle sliced through the crisp Montana air, a lonesome cry that echoed across the rolling hills dotted with sagebrush and pine. Abigail Carter, a widow with a heart scarred by loss, stood on the platform of Willow Valley's small station, clutching a worn leather satchel that held her few belongings and a lifetime of regrets. She had come to this remote corner of the world to cook for a widower and his 6 motherless daughters, a job born of necessity rather than desire. Yet, as the wind tugged at her coat and carried the scent of earth and promise, Abigail felt a stirring deep within, a whisper that this journey might change her in ways she couldn't yet fathom. Before we dive into Abigail's story, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Whether you're in Montana, Maine, or halfway across the globe, we'd love to hear from you and know you're joining us on this heartfelt journey. The Willow Valley station was little more than a weathered wooden platform, its edges softened by years of wind and neglect. Abigail stepped off the train, her boots clicking against the boards, her eyes scanning the vast landscape. The hills stretched endlessly before her, their slopes bathed in the golden light of a late afternoon sun. She was 38, though her face bore the weight of a life far older. Her husband, Henry, had been taken by illness 5 years ago, and her son, Samuel, had followed soon after, lost to a fever that no prayer could break. Since then, Abigail had drifted through life, taking jobs to survive, each one a temporary shield against her grief. This job, cooking and housekeeping for a widower named William Hayes and his 6 daughters, was just another step, or so she told herself. The air smelled of pine and dust, a stark contrast to the city she'd left behind in Boise. Here, the quiet was almost tangible, broken only by the distant call of a hawk. Abigail adjusted her scarf, her fingers brushing the locket around her neck, a keepsake holding a faded photograph of Samuel. She didn't know why she'd answered the ad in the paper. Wanted: cook and housekeeper for widower and 6 girls. Room and board provided. Willow Valley, MT. It promised steady work, a place to sleep, and a chance to keep moving. But as she stood on that platform, waiting for someone to fetch her, she wondered if she was running from her past or stumbling toward something new. A battered pickup truck rumbled into view, kicking up dust as it pulled up to the station. William Hayes stepped out, a man whose broad frame and calloused hands spoke of a life spent wrestling with the land. His face was etched with lines of hardship, his green eyes guarded yet curious beneath the brim of a worn Stetson. "You Abigail Carter?" he asked, his voice deep and rough, like the gravel roads that led to his ranch. "Yes, sir," Abigail replied, her tone polite but wary. She straightened, meeting his gaze, though her stomach knotted with uncertainty. William nodded, his expression unreadable, and gestured to the truck. "Hop in. It's a ways to the ranch." The ride was silent, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional jolt over rutted roads. Abigail glanced at William, noting the tension in his grip on the steering wheel. He didn't speak and she didn't push him. She'd heard whispers in town. William Hayes, a man broken by the death of his wife, Laura, 3 years ago, left to raise 6 girls alone. His days were consumed by the ranch and his grief, leaving little room for warmth. Abigail knew that kind of loss, but she wasn't here to mend anyone's heart, not even her own. The ranch came into view as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the hills. The house was a sprawling, weathered structure of gray clapboard, its paint peeling under the relentless Montana wind. The porch sagged and the windows, clouded with grime, seemed to hold secrets of their own. A barn stood nearby, its roof sagging but sturdy, and beyond it, pastures stretched toward the horizon, dotted with cattle. It was a place that felt both alive and forsaken, as if the land itself was waiting for something to stir it awake. Abigail stepped out of the truck, her satchel in hand, and followed William to the porch. The front door creaked open, revealing a dim interior that smelled of wood smoke and time. The living room was sparse, a worn sofa, a scarred wooden table, and a fireplace flickering weakly. 6 pairs of eyes turned toward her, belonging to girls ranging from 5 to 16. They sat in a loose circle, their faces a mix of curiosity and caution. The youngest, Ellie, clutched a stuffed rabbit, her blue eyes wide and searching. The eldest, Margaret, stood with her arms crossed, her expression guarded, as if weighing Abigail's worth. "Girls, this is Miss Carter," William said, his voice flat. "She's here to cook and keep the house. Make her feel welcome." His words were more order than invitation, and he vanished into the kitchen, leaving Abigail to face the girls alone. Abigail followed William into the house, her footsteps echoing softly on the worn wooden floor. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of aged timber and the faint must of neglect. The Hayes Ranch, nestled in the heart of Willow Valley, seemed to blend into the rugged Montana landscape, a vast, weathered expanse that mirrored the weariness in William's eyes. The house itself was a relic, its clapboard walls cracked by years of harsh winters and unrelenting summers. The small windows, coated in a film of dust, barely let in the fading light of the day, casting the interior in a perpetual dusk that felt both intimate and oppressive. Abigail took in her new surroundings with a mix of curiosity and caution. She had seen many homes in her years of drifting, but none like this. The structure, though simple, seemed to hold countless untold stories, its walls whispering of joys and sorrows long past. The front door, left slightly ajar, creaked as she stepped inside, and the air grew denser, as if time itself had slowed within these walls. William stood at the threshold of the living room, his broad frame filling the doorway. His face, lined with fatigue and solitude, carried the weight of a man who had worked the land his entire life. His eyes, deep and searching, studied Abigail with a blend of expectation and wariness. "Welcome to our home," he said at last, his voice a low rumble that seemed to echo from a distant past. It wasn't a warm greeting, nor was it cold, just a statement born of necessity, shaped by the circumstances that had brought them together. Abigail nodded, trying to muster a polite response, but her words dissolved in the dry air of the house. She wasn't sure how to bridge the invisible gap between them, but something in her gut told her this was more than a job. It was a test, of survival, of resilience, for both herself and this fractured family. She didn't know what to say, how to break the silence that hung like a fog. But as she stood there, clutching her satchel, she felt a quiet resolve. She hadn't come to Willow Valley just to cook for William and his daughters. She had come to heal something within herself, to find shelter from the storm of her own grief, though she wasn't ready to admit it. The locket around her neck, heavy with the memory of Samuel, seemed to pulse against her skin, a reminder of the life she'd lost and the one she was still trying to reclaim. The girls, still seated in the living room, watched her with varying degrees of interest. Margaret, the eldest, stood apart, her arms still crossed, her gaze sharp as if measuring Abigail's every move. Ellie, the youngest, clung to her stuffed rabbit, her small face a mix of curiosity and hope. The others, Lydia, 14, soft-spoken and observant, Charlotte, 12, with a spark of mischief, Beatrice, 10, lost in her own thoughts, and Rose, 8, whose smile seemed to light up the dim room, formed a quiet tableau, each girl a piece of a puzzle Abigail wasn't sure she could solve. "This is where you'll stay," William said, leading her to a small room at the back of the house. It was sparse, with a narrow bed, a rickety wooden chair, and a single window overlooking the endless pastures. The walls smelled of earth and time, a scent that was strangely comforting. "Kitchen's through there," he added, pointing to a doorway. "Girls'll show you where things are. Supper needs to be ready by 6. With that, he turned and left, his boots heavy on the floorboards, leaving Abigail alone with her thoughts. She set her satchel on the bed, her fingers lingering on the locket. She didn't unpack, not yet. The weight of the house, of the girls' watchful eyes, of William's guarded silence, pressed against her. She wasn't here to become part of their lives, she told herself. She was here to work, to cook, to keep her head down and move on when the time came. But as she stepped into the kitchen, a cramped space with a wood-burning stove and shelves cluttered with mismatched dishes, she felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Purpose, perhaps, or the ghost of hope. That first evening, Abigail cooked a simple meal. Beef stew with carrots and potatoes, the kind of hearty fare she'd learned from her mother in Idaho. The girls ate quietly, their spoons clinking against their bowls, their eyes darting between their plates and the stranger at the stove. William sat at the head of the table, his presence a silent anchor, eating with a calm that belied the storm Abigail sensed within him. She served the food, her movements practiced but detached, her mind drifting to the life she'd left behind. She wasn't their mother, she reminded herself. She wasn't here to fill that void. As the days passed, Abigail began to understand the silence that cloaked the house. The routine was straightforward but demanding. Wake before dawn, start the fire, cook breakfast, clean, tend to the girls' needs. William spoke little, offering only brief instructions or responses to her questions. His life was defined by the rhythm of the ranch, cattle to feed, fences to mend, fields to tend, and by a grief that left no room for warmth. Abigail saw it in the way he moved, in the way his eyes lingered on the horizon, as if searching for something lost. Yet, slowly, she began to transform the house. She scrubbed the kitchen until the counters gleamed, swept dust from corners long ignored, and mended curtains that had hung limp for years. She placed a jar of wildflowers, lupins and Indian paintbrush, on the dining table, their vibrant colors a small rebellion against the house's gloom. She made beds with care, folding blankets just so, and cooked with a tenderness that went beyond necessity, as if each meal could nourish more than their bodies, the girls noticed. Rose, the 8-year-old, lingered in the kitchen, her chatter filling the silence. Beatrice showed Abigail her drawings, shyly seeking approval. Charlotte tested boundaries, sneaking extra biscuits, while Lydia watched quietly, her eyes holding a quiet wisdom. Margaret remained distant, her teenage defiance a shield, but even she began to soften, helping with chores without being asked. And Ellie, tiny, fragile Ellie, followed Abigail like a shadow, her stuffed rabbit always in tow, but the house remained a place of shadows, its walls heavy with unspoken loss. The light filtering through the dusty windows cast long, mournful patterns on the floorboards, as if the house itself were grieving. Abigail felt it too, the weight of her own past, the ache of Samuel's absence. She wasn't ready to love again, wasn't ready to let this family in. But as she watched Ellie struggle with her spoon at dinner, her small hands trembling, Abigail's heart gave an unexpected tug. She pushed it away, focusing on the dishes, but the seed of something new had been planted. The days in Willow Valley settled into a rhythm, each one marked by the quiet hum of routine. Abigail rose before dawn, her breath visible in the chilly Montana mornings as she stoked the fire in the kitchen. The wood-burning stove hissed and popped, its warmth chasing away the cold that seeped through the house's thin walls. She cooked breakfast, pancakes or oatmeal, sometimes with a side of bacon, while the girls shuffled in, their faces sleepy but curious. The house, once a chaotic jumble of neglect, began to feel less like a relic and more like a home under Abigail's care, though its shadows lingered. The silence that defined the Hayes household was not just a lack of sound but a presence, heavy and unyielding. William's words were few, reserved for practical matters. Need more firewood, or the girls' coats need mending. His life was tethered to the ranch, its cattle, its fences, its endless demands, and to a grief that seemed to have carved out a permanent place in his heart. Abigail recognized that weight, saw it in the way his shoulders slumped when he thought no one was watching. She didn't ask about Laura, the girl's mother, whose absence hung over the house like a storm cloud. A faded photograph on the mantel showed a woman with a gentle smile, surrounded by younger versions of the girls, and Abigail caught them glancing at it, their eyes filled with a quiet ache. Abigail threw herself into her work, determined to keep her distance from the family's pain. She wasn't here to heal them, she told herself, only to cook and clean, to earn her keep and move on. But the girls made that harder than she expected. Rose's laughter filled the kitchen as she helped stir batter, her small hands clumsy but eager. Beatrice showed Abigail her sketches of the Montana hills, her shy smile seeking approval. Charlotte's mischief brought chaos but also life, while Lydia's quiet presence was a steady anchor. Margaret remained aloof, her teenage skepticism a barrier, but even she began to linger, helping with chores without complaint. And Ellie, with her wide blue eyes and stuffed rabbit, followed Abigail everywhere, her silent adoration both a comfort and a weight point. One evening, as the sun painted the valley in hues of gold and crimson, Abigail prepared a special dinner. A simple beef stew with carrots and potatoes, but made with care, each ingredient chosen to warm the body and soul. The dining table, adorned with a jar of wildflowers, felt less empty than before, though the chairs still seemed to hold ghosts. The girls sat around it, eating quietly, their spoons clinking softly. William sat at the head, his presence steady but distant, his eyes fixed on his plate. Abigail served the food, her movements practiced, but she felt the weight of their gazes, as if they were waiting for something more than a meal. As she sat to eat, Ellie's small voice broke the silence, piercing the quiet like a bell. "Miss Abigail," she said, her eyes fixed on her bowl, "are you my mama now?" The question stopped Abigail cold, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. The room seemed to hold its breath, the girls' eyes turning to her, each face a mix of hope, curiosity, and caution. Margaret's gaze was sharp, almost challenging, while Rose's was soft and expectant. William paused, his fork resting on his plate, his expression unreadable. Abigail's heart thudded, the words echoing in her mind. She thought of Samuel, his laughter, his tiny hand in hers, and the pain of his loss surged like a wave. She wasn't ready for this, wasn't ready to be anyone's mother again. Swallowing hard, Abigail set her fork down, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I'm not your mama, Ellie," she said softly, "but I'll take care of you and your sisters like you were my own." She forced a smile, hoping it masked the ache in her chest. Ellie nodded, her face brightening as if Abigail's words were enough, a small light in the darkness of her longing. The other girls returned to their food, but the air felt different, charged, as if Ellie's question had cracked open a door that had been sealed shut. William said nothing, his eyes lingering on Abigail for a moment before returning to his plate. She couldn't tell if he approved or merely observed, but something in his gaze felt softer, less guarded. The silence returned, but it was no longer just a void, it carried a hint of warmth, a whisper of connection. Abigail felt it, though she wasn't ready to name it. She cleared the table, her hands moving automatically, but Ellie's question lingered, a seed planted in the soil of her heart. That night, as the Montana wind howled outside, Abigail lay in her small room, the wooden walls creaking softly. The bed was hard, the mattress thin, but it offered a strange comfort, a grounding in this unfamiliar place. Sleep came slowly, her mind replaying Ellie's words. She thought of Samuel, of the life she'd lost, and the locket around her neck felt heavier than ever. She didn't want to love these girls, didn't want to risk her heart again. But as she drifted into sleep, she felt a flicker of something new, a warmth, a possibility, a chance to be more than a stranger in this house. The night settled over the Hayes ranch like a heavy quilt, the Montana wind whispering through the pines and rattling the windows of the old house. Inside, the silence was profound, broken only by the soft crackle of the fireplace in the living room. Abigail lay in her small room at the back of the house, the scent of aged wood and earth enveloping her. The bed, though simple and hard, offered a strange comfort, as if the house itself were trying to cradle her weary soul. But sleep was elusive, the echo of Ellie's question, "Are you my mama now?" still ringing in her mind, stirring memories she'd long tried to bury. Abigail's thoughts drifted to Samuel, her son, whose laughter once filled her days. The pain of his loss, sharp and unrelenting, surged through her, and in the darkness, she felt the weight of her grief press against her chest. She clutched the locket around her neck, its cool metal a tether to a life that no longer existed. She had come to Willow Valley to escape, to work, to survive, not to open her heart again. Yet the girls, with their quiet need, were pulling at the edges of her resolve, and she wasn't sure she could resist. Sleep finally came, but it was restless, haunted by dreams that twisted into nightmares. In her mind, she saw Samuel's face, his small hand reaching for her, then fading into shadow. She woke with a gasp, her heart pounding, her body slick with sweat. The room felt oppressive, the air heavy with an anxiety she couldn't shake. Tears came unbidden, streaming down her face as she sat up, her breath ragged. The darkness seemed to close in, amplifying the ache of her loss. She thought of Henry, of Samuel, of the life that had crumbled beneath her, leaving her alone in a world that felt too big, too empty. In the stillness, a soft creak broke her reverie. Abigail turned to see a small figure in the doorway, Ellie, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her nightgown brushing the floor. Without a word, the girl padded across the room and climbed onto the bed, curling up beside Abigail. The warmth of her small body was a shock, a quiet offering of comfort that Abigail didn't know she needed. Ellie's presence was like a balm, soothing the raw edges of her grief. Before Abigail could speak, another figure appeared, Rose, her bright eyes dimmed with concern, followed by Beatrice, then Charlotte. One by one, the girls slipped into the room, their small forms finding space on the bed or the floor beside it. Margaret lingered in the doorway, her arms crossed, but even she stepped closer, settling on the edge of the bed. They said nothing, their silence a language of its own, as if they sensed Abigail's pain and offered their presence as a shield against it. Abigail's tears continued to fall, but they were different now, less bitter, softened by the warmth of the girls surrounding her. She didn't understand why they had come, how they knew she needed them, but their closeness was a lifeline. Ellie nestled closer, her small hand resting on Abigail's arm, and Abigail felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in years: connection. The girl's quiet breathing filled the room, a rhythm that steadied her own. She didn't know how long they stayed like that, huddled together in the dim light of the moon filtering through the window. The wind outside continued its mournful song, but inside, the room felt different, warmer, safer. Abigail's eyes grew heavy, and as she drifted back to sleep, the nightmares didn't return. Instead, she dreamed of a field bathed in sunlight, of laughter that sounded like Samuel's but also like the girl's, a chorus of voices that reminded her there was still life to be lived. When morning came, the girls were gone, their small forms slipped back to their own beds before dawn. Abigail rose, her body heavy with exhaustion but her heart lighter than it had been in years. She moved to the kitchen, starting the fire as the first rays of sunlight crept over the Montana hills. The routine, chopping vegetables, kneading dough, felt different now, infused with a purpose she hadn't noticed before. She wasn't just cooking for the Hayes family. She was building something, though she couldn't yet name it. As the girls trickled into the kitchen for breakfast, their faces sleepy but soft, Abigail caught their glances, Ellie's shy smile, Rose's chatter, even Margaret's guarded nod. William appeared last, his eyes lingering on Abigail for a moment longer than usual. He didn't mention the night before, didn't ask about the girl's quiet pilgrimage to her room, but his gaze held a flicker of understanding, as if he, too, felt the shift in the house. Abigail served oatmeal and fresh milk, her hands steady but her heart still reeling from the night's tenderness. She wasn't their mother, she reminded herself, but the girl's presence in her room had planted a seed of possibility. For the first time, she wondered if she could be more than a cook, more than a stranger passing through. As she watched Ellie spoon oatmeal into her mouth, her stuffed rabbit tucked beside her, Abigail felt a warmth she hadn't known since Samuel, a warmth that scared her as much as it comforted her. The days in Willow Valley unfolded slowly, each one weaving Abigail deeper into the fabric of the Hayes household. She woke before dawn, the Montana air sharp and cool as she lit the kitchen fire, the crackle of kindling a quiet companion. The routine, cooking, cleaning, tending to the girls, had become a rhythm, steady and grounding. She made pancakes drizzled with syrup from town, or eggs scrambled with bits of bacon, and the girls gathered around the table, their chatter growing bolder with each passing day. The house, once a hollow shell of grief, began to hum with a tentative warmth, though its shadows lingered in the corners. Abigail noticed the traces of Laura, the girl's mother, in every room. A faded quilt draped over a chair, its stitches worn but precise, a chipped teacup on a shelf, untouched but cherished, the photograph on the mantel where Laura's smile seemed to watch over them all. The girls never spoke of her, but Abigail saw it in their eyes. Lydia's quiet glances at the photo, Beatrice's fingers tracing the quilt's patterns, Margaret's guarded silence when the others laughed too loudly. Abigail didn't ask about Laura. The weight of that loss was too heavy, too private, for an outsider like her. But she felt it, a mirror to her own grief for Samuel, and it stirred a longing to offer the girls something more than meals, something to ease the ache they carried. She threw herself into her work, not just to keep busy but to create something tangible. She scrubbed the floors until they gleamed, mended the girls' dresses with careful stitches, and arranged wildflowers, lupins and columbines, in a jar on the table. Each meal was a small act of care, from hearty stews to fresh-baked cornbread, as if she could feed their hearts as well as their bodies. The girls responded in their own ways. Rose's laughter filled the kitchen, Charlotte's pranks brought chaos and grins, and even Margaret began to help without prompting, her hands steady as she peeled potatoes. One afternoon, the sky darkened with a sudden fury, clouds rolling in like a tide over the Montana hills. The wind howled, rattling the windows and bending the pines, and Abigail felt a prickle of unease as she kneaded dough in the kitchen. From the window, she saw the storm gather strength, the air thick with the scent of rain and electricity. The first drops fell, soft at first, then heavy, until the world outside was a blur of water and wind. A loud crack echoed from the pasture, and Abigail rushed to the porch, where William stood, his eyes fixed on the fence that bordered the cattle fields. Several posts had splintered under the storm's assault, the wooden slats swaying dangerously. The cattle lowed, their unease growing as the wind tore at the fence. "We've got to fix it before it's gone," William said, his voice steady but urgent, the first hint of emotion Abigail had heard in it. She nodded, grabbing a hammer and nails from the shed, her coat already soaked as she stepped into the rain. They worked side by side, hammering posts into the muddy ground, their movements synchronized despite the chaos around them. The rain stung Abigail's face, but she pressed on, driven by a need to protect this place that was slowly becoming more than a job. The girls watched from the porch, their faces pressed against the windows, until Ellie ran out, her small frame dwarfed by the storm. "Miss Abigail, can I help?" she called, her voice barely audible over the wind, her stuffed rabbit clutched tight. Abigail hesitated, then smiled through the rain. "Stay close, Ellie. Hold these nails for me." The girl beamed, her small hands trembling but eager, as if the storm were just a game. Together, they fought the elements, Abigail and William securing the fence while Ellie stood by, a tiny sentinel in the downpour. As they worked, Ellie's voice cut through the storm's roar, small but piercing. "Miss Abigail, can you fix Mama's heart?" The question hit like a lightning bolt, stopping Abigail in her tracks. The hammer slipped from her hand, landing in the mud with a dull thud. She knelt, rain streaming down her face, and looked into Ellie's wide, innocent eyes. The girl didn't understand the weight of her words, but Abigail did. The storm raged around them, but all she could hear was that question, echoing her own loss, her own broken heart. She thought of Samuel, of the void he'd left, and her throat tightened. "I can't fix your mama's heart, sweetheart," Abigail said, her voice breaking as a tear mixed with the rain. "But I can love you, all of you, with everything I've got." Ellie nodded, her face bright with trust, unaware of the depth of her question. William, working a few feet away, paused, his eyes meeting Abigail's through the rain. He said nothing, but his gaze held a flicker of understanding, as if he, too, felt the weight of that moment. They finished the fence as the storm began to ease, the rain slowing to a drizzle. Abigail's clothes clung to her, heavy and cold, but she felt a strange warmth inside. Ellie's question had cracked something open, not just in her but in the air between them all. Back in the house, Abigail lit candles, their soft glow pushing back the damp chill. She made hot cocoa for the girls, who huddled by the fire, their laughter mingling with the crackle of the flames. William sat nearby, his silence softer now, his eyes lingering on Abigail as she moved through the room. That night, as she tucked the girls into bed, Abigail felt a shift. She wasn't their mother, couldn't replace Laura, but she was something else. Something they needed, something she needed too. The storm had tested them, but it had also bound them, a shared struggle that felt like the beginning of something new. As she lay in her own bed, the wind still whispering outside, Abigail wondered if she could let herself love again, if she could find a place in this family without losing herself to the pain of her past. The rhythm of life on the Hayes Ranch had become Abigail's anchor, each day a quiet testament to her growing connection with the family. She rose with the dawn, the Montana sky a canvas of soft pinks and golds as she lit the kitchen fire, its warmth spreading through the house. She cooked hearty breakfasts, biscuits with gravy, eggs with sausage, while the girls filled the kitchen with their chatter, their voices weaving a fragile tapestry of warmth. The house, once a hollow shell, now hummed with life, though the weight of Laura's absence lingered in the faded photographs and the girls' fleeting glances. Abigail had learned to read the girls' silences, their unspoken needs. Rose sought her out for stories, her laughter a bright spark in the morning gloom. Beatrice shared her drawings, her shy pride glowing when Abigail praised her work. Charlotte's mischief brought chaos but also joy, while Lydia's quiet wisdom grounded them all. Margaret, still guarded, had begun to soften, helping with chores and offering rare, fleeting smiles. And Ellie, with her stuffed rabbit and endless questions, clung to Abigail like a shadow, her trust a weight that both comforted and terrified her. But one night, the fragile peace of the house was shattered. A harsh, rasping cough echoed from the girls' room, sharp and relentless in the quiet. Abigail bolted upright in her bed, her heart racing as she recognized the sound, not just a cold, but something deeper, more dangerous. She hurried down the hall, the floorboards cold beneath her bare feet, and found Lydia, the 14-year-old, curled on her bed, her face pale and slick with sweat. Her breathing was labored, each cough a struggle, and her eyes fluttered open, seeking comfort in the dark. Abigail knelt beside her, pressing a hand to Lydia's forehead. It burned, the heat radiating through her palm, and panic surged in Abigail's chest. Memories of Samuel's fever, of his small body fading in her arms, flooded back, threatening to drown her. She pushed them away, forcing herself to focus. "Lydia, I'm here," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her. The other girls stirred, their faces pale with worry, but they stayed back, their eyes fixed on Abigail, as if she alone could hold the darkness at bay. "William!" Abigail called, her voice sharp with urgency. He appeared in the doorway, his hair disheveled, his eyes wide with alarm as he saw Lydia's condition. "Get the doctor," Abigail said, her tone leaving no room for hesitation. "Tell him it's urgent." William nodded, grabbing his coat and disappearing into the night, the door slamming behind him as he ran toward town. Alone with Lydia, Abigail fought to keep her panic at bay. The girls' coughs grew harsher, each one a knife in Abigail's heart. She grabbed a damp cloth from the basin, pressing it gently to Lydia's forehead, trying to ease the fever's grip. "Stay with me, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice soft but firm, as if she could will Lydia to hold on. She coaxed her to sip water, though Lydia's lips barely moved, and sat by her side, holding her hand, her own fear a shadow she refused to let take hold. The other girls hovered nearby, their faces etched with fear. Ellie clutched her rabbit, her eyes wide, while Margaret stood in the corner, her arms crossed but her gaze soft with worry. Abigail worked tirelessly, cooling Lydia's fever, whispering words of comfort, though her own heart trembled. She couldn't lose another child. Not here, not now. The memory of Samuel's final moments haunted her, but she pushed it down, focusing on Lydia's shallow breaths, the faint rise and fall of her chest. Time stretched, each minute an eternity, until finally Lydia's fever began to break. Her breathing eased, the coughs growing less violent, and her face relaxed into a fitful sleep. Abigail exhaled, her body sagging with relief, though exhaustion weighed heavy on her. She stayed by Lydia's side, her hands still clasped around the girls, unwilling to let go until she was certain the danger had passed. The door creaked open, and William returned with the doctor, a grizzled man with a worn medical bag. He examined Lydia, his movements brisk but gentle, and confirmed that the worst was over. "She'll pull through," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "You did well, keeping her cool and calm." Abigail nodded, too tired to speak, but her eyes met William's across the room. His gaze held gratitude, and something else, a quiet respect that hadn't been there before. As the doctor left, Abigail stayed with Lydia, watching her sleep. The other girls had returned to their beds, their soft snores filling the room. William lingered in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the hall. "Thank you, Abigail," he said, his voice low but heavy with meaning. She looked up, her throat tight, and managed a small nod. The moment passed, but it left a mark, a silent acknowledgement of the bond forming between them. Abigail finally returned to her room, her body aching but her heart full. She had fought for Lydia, had held back the shadow of loss that threatened to claim her. In that fight, she realized something profound. She wasn't just a cook or a housekeeper anymore. She was someone who cared, who loved, who would stand against the darkness for these girls. As she lay down, the Montana wind soft outside her window, she felt a flicker of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find a place in this family, a purpose beyond her pain. The days following Lydia's illness marked a turning point in the Hayes household. The Montana mornings dawned brighter, the air crisp with the promise of fall, and the ranch seemed to breathe easier, as if the storm of fear had cleared the way for something new. Abigail moved through her routine with a quiet purpose, her hands steady as she kneaded dough or mended clothes, but her heart was different, lighter, fuller, as if the girl's trust had begun to mend the cracks in her own. The house, once heavy with grief, now carried a warmth that grew with each shared meal, each small moment of connection. The girls sought Abigail out in ways they hadn't before. Ellie, with her stuffed rabbit always in tow, clung to her side, her questions endless but her smile a gift. Rose's laughter filled the kitchen as she helped Abigail bake, her chatter a melody that chased away the silence. Beatrice shared more of her drawings, her confidence growing with Abigail's praise, while Charlotte's pranks softened into playful teasing. Lydia, now recovered, lingered longer at the table, her quiet gratitude a steady presence. Even Margaret, the most guarded, began to open up, her sharp edges softening as she helped with chores or shared stories of the ranch's past. Abigail saw Laura's absence in every corner, the faded quilt, the untouched teacup, the photograph that held the girl's gaze, but she no longer felt like an intruder. She couldn't replace their mother, nor did she want to, but she could offer something else. Love, care, a steady hand to guide them through their pain. Each meal she cooked, each bed she made, each smile she coaxed from the girls was a small act of healing, not just for them but for herself. The locket around her neck, heavy with Samuel's memory, no longer felt like a burden but a reminder that love could endure even through loss. One evening, as Abigail tended the small garden behind the house, planting late-season herbs under the fading Montana sun, Margaret approached, her steps hesitant. The 16-year-old had always been the hardest to reach, her defiance a shield against the world. But now, her arms were uncrossed, her eyes soft with something new. "Miss Abigail," she said, her voice low but firm, "I didn't think anyone could make this house feel like home again. Not after Mama. But you've done it. Thank you, for everything." The words hit Abigail like a warm breeze, soothing the ache she'd carried for years. She set down her trowel, her throat tight, and looked at Margaret. "I'm not your Mama, Margaret," she said softly, "but I'm here for you, for all of you." Margaret nodded, a rare smile breaking through, and for the first time, Abigail felt she had truly found her place. The other girls noticed the change too. Ellie began to hug Abigail without hesitation, her small arms a quiet promise. Rose took her hand during walks through the pastures, while Beatrice left drawings on the kitchen table for Abigail to find. Charlotte's mischief became a shared joke, and Lydia's quiet presence felt like a gift. The house, once cold and distant, now glowed with a warmth that came from small, everyday moments: laughter over breakfast, stories by the fire, the soft creak of the porch swing as the girls gathered around Abigail. One afternoon, as Abigail weeded the garden, William approached, his Stetson in his hands, his face softer than she'd ever seen it. The man who had once been a stranger, closed off by grief, now stood before her with a quiet openness. "Abigail," he said, his voice steady but warm, "you've done more than cook and clean. You've brought this family back to life. You're not just here, you're one of us." The words settled over Abigail like a blanket, filling the empty spaces in her heart. She looked at William, her eyes misting, and nodded, unable to speak. His gaze held hers, not just with gratitude but with a recognition of what she had become to his daughters, to him, to this home. It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was enough, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond they'd built, forged through shared silences and small acts of care. That evening, as the sun dipped below the Montana hills, casting a golden glow over the ranch, Abigail sat at the dining table with the girls. They laughed and talked, their voices mingling with the clink of spoons against bowls. William joined them, his presence no longer heavy but steady, grounding. Abigail looked around the table, at the faces of the girls who had become her purpose, and felt a peace she hadn't known since Samuel. Her grief for him, for Henry, would always be part of her, but it no longer defined her. In its place was something new. A family, not by blood but by choice. As the stars emerged in the Montana sky, Abigail knew she had found her home. The ranch, with its weathered walls and creaking floors, was no longer just a stop on her journey. It was where she belonged, where she could love and be loved, where she could heal and help others heal. She wasn't Laura, and she didn't need to be. She was Abigail Carter, and in the quiet moments of care, in the laughter and tears shared with the girls, she had found a new dawn, a life worth living, a family worth fighting for.